I think we're going to see a lot of natural language interfaces. Like, I'll just tell you what to do, right? Why do you want me to learn where you are, in which menu, this click, that click, 4 clicks, and then I get to the thing that I want to do? I'll just give you an instruction, right? You figure it out.
Once again, welcome to the Digital Customer Experience Podcast with me, Alex Turkovich. So glad you could join us here today and every week as we explore how digital can help enhance the customer and employee experience. My goal is to share what my guests and I have learned over the years so that you can get the insights that you need to evolve your own digital programs. If you'd like more info, need to get in touch, or sign up for the weekly companion newsletter that has additional articles and resources in it, go to digitalcustomersuccess.com. For now, let's get started. Greetings and welcome back to the Digital CX Podcast. My name is Alex Turkovich. I'm so glad that you made it back this week and every week as we talk about all things digital CX. It is episode 67. But before we get into the episode, I want to let you know about an upcoming event. I've mentioned this before, but Sam David and Scott Wilder and I are hosting what will be a monthly Digital and Scale meetup. That's going to happen on roughly the first Thursday of every month. First one's coming up on September 5th at 11 Central, and we are going to have a special guest, DCX podcast veteran Aaron Hatton, on to talk about all things personalization in digital CX. So that is coming up September 5th, midday. We made it to where most time zones could attend. So to sign up and to register for that, go to digitalscale.org. There you can register for that event and the other events that we have upcoming. We have a whole lineup of cool people coming up towards the end of the year in Q4. For today, I had a great conversation with Joydeep Sen Sarma, who is founder, CEO of Clearfeed, which is an amazing tool that is all about turning Slack into an effective customer management tool, or basically a support tool, ticketing function, SLAs, like all kinds of fun stuff. If you've ever tried to use Slack in a customer-facing kind of way, it's a hot mess. And so, what Clearfeed does is it helps make it more manageable. So we talk about that, obviously, and a bunch of other stuff related to technology and CX. So I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with Joydeep, because I certainly did. Well, look, Joydeep, it's a pleasure having you on the show. It was a pleasure meeting you. And I wanted to make sure that we got you on the show because I think what you and the team are doing is fascinating and very relevant to the world of digital CS, and we'll get there. It's just a pleasure having you on the show, and thank you for taking time out of your night to be here.
Sure, thanks for having me. Yeah, hopefully I'll have a fun talk for your podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I want to go back into the history books a little bit because I feel like, so you studied computer science in a very interesting time, which is to say the late 90s.
Yeah, I did.
If I'm remembering correctly, it was in Delhi for like a bachelor's, and then you went to, was it Pittsburgh for your master's?
Yeah, for a master's, yeah.
That must have been a trip.
Yes, of course. It was a very different era. I think nowadays, the world is very connected. So even if you're physically separate, everybody's watching the same Netflix. Everybody's watching, reading the same news, hanging out on the same social media. It was a much more disconnected world back then. So there was a big gap between these two countries, like both economically as well as, from a ideas and sort of knowledge, or all the things that we are able to share so easily. So it was a very big jump. Nowadays, I think it's not such a big jump anymore. Because we are a much more connected world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I can only imagine the environment in which you were learning all this stuff. I mean, I remember, those are the days of like MIRC and those kinds of like fun little back roads of the internet where, the initial like stages of the internet where we were all just learning about how to communicate and chat with each other and do all those kinds of things. Like,
Yahoo had just launched, and it was like one of the hottest companies.
yeah.
Everybody had just started building applications in PHP.
Yeah.
I was, from for good or bad, I was from one of the IITs, which is, as many people know, it was one of the top schools in India, and now, of course, well known throughout the world. So we were supposed to do big things, right? So we were taught on mainframes and Unix and all this stuff. So when the internet came out and everybody started building apps in PHP, and all the people from IIT were like not so impressed by all these young startups and all these crazy little languages coming out.
Yeah.
I think there were a lot of learning lessons even there. Don't take new things lightly. They tend to become big, important things.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so interesting. I just saw the other day, actually, it might have already happened, that ICQ. Do you remember using ICQ? It's like
I think that was a long time back.
Like they're shutting down like now, which is like, wow, I didn't even know they existed still, but it was like
they existed,
owned by some Russian company. But I guess the point is, like, you saw a lot of things happening then that are kind of happening now in the realm of generative AI and all that kind of stuff, machine learning. Like it's basically it's very similar renaissance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we saw. I've been I would say, through two sort of really big inflection points in technology. One was, of course, the internet, which is when we kind of joined the workforce. I would say, my experience level was not that high at that point. So, I don't think I fully understood what we were going through. But then, I think the cloud was I would say 2-3 things happened. Like, cloud was very big, in my life, in my personal journey. The whole sort of, all the software and even now infrastructure and everything moving to the cloud was a very, very big sort of a wave that we went through.
Yeah.
I guess that was the last, 10 years, 10 to 12 years. That was a big part of my previous startup journey. There have been a lot of other waves also. So I was actually, I spent a lot of years in the storage industry before I started working in internet companies.
Mm-hmm.
So the storage industry went through similar sort of curves. I don't know how many people know or remember these things now, but it went through a curve where the tape got displaced by disk.
Yeah.
And then disk got replaced by solid state, right? All the flash and sort of non-volatile RAM and those kind of things, right? So there were sort of like waves, and but there was a little bit less well known than the internet and cloud waves. And of course, there was the mobile wave. I don't think I was ever a part of that journey, but I think it was also a very, very important one, obviously, for people who were working in that sort of sphere.
Totally. Yeah. I looked back the other day at Steve Jobs' 2007 iPhone announcement. And I don't know if you've watched that like recently, because it's interesting to look at it now. I mean, Steve Jobs was always a really good kind of presenter, and he I think he really flourished in product announcements and things like that. Just that watershed moment of, bringing together, I think, what are the words they use? Like, we're 3 new products. It's an iPod with a touchscreen, and it's, what was the other one? It's an internet communications device, and it's a new cell phone or whatever it is. And then he's like, all in one. It's like everybody went, wow. And now it's like whatever. But that was, that was a one pinpoint moment where like everything changed. It's crazy.
Right.
Crazy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I was at Facebook. I remember. I think I was at Facebook at that time. We were all on Blackberries, and then we started using iPhones. I still remember when I got my first iPhone, I was a little frustrated. I couldn't get the buttons. I was used to the BlackBerry stuff. So wasn't too fond initially of that screen experience.
You wanted the tactile button.
It's kind of funny to remember now. Yeah, I was complaining to the IT guy. Yeah, this is not working. Like, this doesn't work the way. And I remember the battery was really lousy initially, so we had to like turn off location tracking or whatever they had at that time.
Yeah,
the equivalent of GPS, and I had to turn it off because otherwise it would just die like really fast. But I don't think we got it right, that this was going to be like so big.
Right.
And it was very important for Facebook as a company, actually. That was the other part that I think it took even Facebook some time to realize that. But it was very important for Facebook. I mean, of course, like with everything else, once Zuckerberg sort of got the hang of it, that this was important, he kind of just nailed it,
Yeah.
right? He bought Instagram and then he fixed Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
But it took us a while to, come out of the desktop sort of thinking mode
Sure.
and focus on that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating to think about. Well, look, we are on the Digital Customer Experience podcast. And one of the things that I do like to ask every single one of my guests is essentially their own definition of digital customer success. And, knowing that your background isn't necessarily in customer success, but you've been supporting, these motions and whatever, I wanted to desperately get kind of your take on, what is, if you were to describe digital CS to somebody on an elevator for a couple of seconds, what would that be?
Yeah. So, I think you hit the nail. I think, all of us are shaped by our personal experiences. My personal experience over the last 10 plus years has been building applications and infrastructure in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been sort of what you might call the SaaS, B2B sort of part of the economy. When I look back at my experience, and if I were to summarize it in just one line, I think the era of transactional approach to customer success or customer support is something that, I think at least in large parts of the industry, I think are sunsetting or in transition mode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think, what happened with the whole cloud is for many, many companies, you're sort of in this subscription business and you're trying to grow your business. First you land and expand, right? These are famous acronyms.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? And every company, a big part of its growth comes from expand. Making existing customers grow and get new use cases.
Yeah.
Make sure they're happy, make sure they don't leave, the churn is low, and so on, right? And that's something very different from the era where you were not selling subscription. You were just sort of selling these CDs of software or maybe a hardware box, right? And once you made the sale, it was done, right? And so, once you made the sale, any support you did was pure overhead.
Yeah.
Your sale was already done.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But you've gone from that era to one where your initial sale is actually very little,
Mm-hmm.
and your entire focus is on growing the revenues over time, right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, like that is the definitive sort of I would say the change, I would say. And I worked in those industries. So I worked in Network Appliance, which was a hardware appliance maker.
Yeah.
And we had great customer support, and we had great sort of reputation for being a customer friendly company. But I think the nature of customer interactions was very, very different.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think, what I really feel is that at least for like people in my part of the industry, the SaaS B2B kind of industry, it's all become about, non-transactional, little bit sort of white glove, something in between. You're a product company, but you're kind of not just a product company. You're also a bit of a services company.
Yeah.
You're working closely with customers. You're sort of making sure they're successful, making sure, you are part of their team.
Right.
So I think the non-transactional part is, hey, we are an extended part of your team. You can come and talk to us anytime,
Mm-hmm.
right, with
Mm-hmm.
your problems, and
Mm-hmm.
we'll do our best to solve it, right? Of course, that leads to a lot of issues, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of them. But I think that is the approach, that has is really required to succeed in, I think, this cloud era. And I think there are a lot of like layers and layers of things that I can talk about here, but I would say particularly for if you're not one of the big cloud vendors, like if you're like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, then I think you can afford to be maybe a little bit transactional because
Mm-hmm.
of your overwhelming sort of market dominance and sort of your size and sort of
Sure.
stuff like that. But I think, if you're anybody other than those companies and you're trying to build a sort of a bit of a niche sort of a business, I think white glove customer service, quick response, a lot of love, growing usage, non-transactional service. I think these are very important parts of what I think of as CS for me.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny because in I still don't quite understand why a lot of people especially, a lot of people who work in SaaS, but may not be, super familiar with, the business of SaaS, don't actively and fully realize that the money is actually in the post sale. Like that's where your revenue is. Sure, you need to feed the
Yeah.
funnel, and sure, you need to go out
Right.
and close new deals, new logos, and things like that, because that's how you grow. But you know, your money is in the post sale and securing the renewal and driving value and those kinds of things, which is made
Also, even some of the growth, referrals are
sure.
a big part of growth, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Some of the stories that, again, everybody has their own biases, but I love some of the stories that come from companies that grew by mostly word of mouth. Like, one of my favorite stories is a very famous company, unfortunately got bought out recently, called MailChimp.
Yeah, sure.
I just loved reading their story. The way they grew by just treating every customer well.
Yeah.
They didn't. I don't think they had a sales force. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they were quite famous for not having a sales force. I think there's a couple others
Yeah.
like that too. Like Canva. Canva grew very organically without a lot of
Right.
sales, and I guess that gets into PLG versus SLG and all that kind of fun stuff, and how people like
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
categorize us. But I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately,
Yeah.
it's interesting. So, and I think this is where what you're building fits in amazingly well. So, I don't like putting words in founders' mouths,
Sure.
but essentially you're building customer facing, the ability to easily engage customers over Slack and Teams, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about Clearfeed and where it came from and what
Sure.
you're
Yeah.
building?
I think this is a good continuation of the topic that we just started off. So, like I said, my background was in building infrastructure and applications for cloud-based cloud-based infrastructure and applications. Growing usage and business was a big part of my role, even though I was not directly a CS professional, but I was a founder at my previous company.
Yeah.
And what I found was that increasingly these chat tools, whether it is Slack for Slack native companies, or for others it's Microsoft Teams, or
Hmm.
maybe for some of them it's even Google Chat. I think the world is sort of shifting there. People just want to log into their favorite chat application and just stay there all day and just do all the work there.
Right.
I think people don't realize how dramatic the change is. I think if you're an older company, you're probably still spending a lot of time on email and
Mm.
spending some time on these chat tools.
Sure.
But I think if you look at the younger companies who are getting born today, they're just completely on Slack or
Yeah.
whatever their tool of choice is. So anyway, I think, but this also creates a lot of problem. I think when I started this company, um, I had this sort of a little sort of vague mission in my head that how do we make it easier for people to deal with sort of noise in the workplace?
Mm.
And I found that the center of noise is often these Slack channels, and obviously, using Slack for dealing with hundreds of customers is not something it's designed to do. So I think in that spectrum of sort of pain, I think this particularly stood out as easily identifiable, and something that a lot of people were having problems with.
I
So
mean,
anyway,
look, I'm
we
looking at
built
my
a
Slack notifications right now, and it makes me want to close it and forget it,
right.
because it's just like no, and me just thinking about having to support customers using it like gives me
Right.
anxiety, right?
Right. Yeah, but customers love it.
Yeah.
I think while a vendor may be dealing with 100 customers and it might be seem like a nightmare, for every customer, this is a direct
Yeah.
line of contact with a bunch of really important stakeholders on the
Hmm.
other side.
Hmm.
And customers love to chat with experts, they love to chat with their solutions architect, with the support person, with
Yeah.
maybe the engineer, the PM, they just love it, right? Um, so just I'll just jump to where we are. So we've built a software that essentially converts Slack into a help desk.
Hmm.
It's sort of a little bit unique. It's not a classic sort of a customer support software. So you can be in touch with hundreds of customers on Slack, and they will feel like they're just chatting with you.
Yeah.
But our system sort of picks up every conversation, every message posted by customers, posted by responders in the team, and brings it internally into a very structured format,
Hmm.
where if you are, let's say, head of support or head of technical services, or you're running sort of like onboarding or pre-sales and all these functions that are responsible for onboarding customers, supporting customers, growing customers,
Yeah.
you can get a single view across all of your customers. You can monitor one single dashboard or a few Slack channels, and just sort of be able to tackle this entire thing just from one console. That's been very successful for us. We are in production at a lot of very, very classic sort of infrastructure and applications software in the cloud. Some names, like I can just cite some of them, like Chronosphere is a big observability company. It helps customers I think monitor their cloud infrastructure. It's a very well-known company in their space. Teleport is another one on the connectivity space, and Astronomer in the data space. So you've got a bunch of like these really well-known technology B2B SaaS companies using us for exactly what I described to you. But we are also a horizontal tool. So the same way you can serve your customers, you can obviously serve your employees as well. So we are also increasingly being used internally.
That's fantastic. So there's a couple of things I want to dig in on here, because when I first learned about you guys, I was like, yes, let's go. But like, one of the things that is a commonality in that earlier question that I posed to you about what is digital customer success, and a lot of people define it as getting the right information to the right customer contact at the right time where they are, right? And I think that last bit is super key, because to your point, like, the go-to is always email. Well, guess what? People get lost in, you get lost in inboxes like super, super quickly. And, especially in an environment where maybe you haven't, implemented in-app stuff yet, or in-app communication, or you're not a platform. If you're a non-platform, provider where you can't do in-app, this kind of stuff, along with other things like maybe SMS or something like that, is an amazing way to do exactly that, like get in front of your customers where they are when they need it.
Yeah, I think in-app, that's a really interesting point. In a lot of modern sort of software, there is no app. So for example, let's take an example of one of the companies I just mentioned, right? Chronosphere, which is a observability company. Most of the times you're interacting to that company or that product through things like alerts. You're not really logging in and watching an application. It's some alert that's coming to you. It's some dashboard that might be embedded inside your software. So I think the world has become very it's very, very fragmented, I guess, for lack of a better word. A lot of people don't have apps, or the app is not their primary experience. The primary experience could be a terminal. It could be a virtual machine.
Sure.
It could be logging in somewhere. You could be selling sort of network, something in the network layer or in the cloud optimization layer. And there's just like so much stuff out there. So I think for all of these reasons, this medium has also emerged because of these reasons, that, hey, this is the natural place. We don't really have the app as the dominant construct.
Makes sense. Hey, I want to have a brief chat with you about this show. Did you know that roughly 60% of listeners aren't actually subscribed to the show on whatever platform they're listening to it on? Now, as you know, algorithms love likes, follows, subscribes, comments, all of that kind of stuff. So if you get value out of the content, you listen regularly, and you want to help others to discover the content as well, please go ahead and follow the show, leave a comment, leave a review. Anything that you want to do there really helps us to grow organically as a show. And while you're at it, go sign up for the companion newsletter that goes out every week at digitalcustomersuccess.com. Now, back to the show. Are there some interesting use cases that have come out of your customer base? I mean, surely there are some people using, Clearfeed for just interesting things beyond just like having a specific customer channel and things like that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we discussed a little bit of this, I think, when we first met. It's definitely been a learning journey for me as well. We have seen some interesting patterns. Let me try to recall some of them. The classic one, of course, is is just working with your customers on Slack. That's just one-on-one, and it's very traditional. I think the couple of things that I think took me a little bit by surprise is support teams are a very important part of this overall equation. And support teams usually love the support too. So, like if you're a Zendesk shop, the support team is spending all of their time on Zendesk.
Yeah.
If you're on Intercom, you're spending a lot of time on Intercom and so on, right? Similarly, if you're engineers, you're probably spending a lot of time on Jira or GitHub or something like that, wherever you track your engineering issues, right? So one of the things we found was that while people love to collaborate on Slack, there are sort of other software that are very important part of the ecosystem. And some people actually prefer to work there. They don't actually want to come and work in Slack, right?
Yeah.
So it was a little bit surprising for me, but integration is actually a very, very important part of this puzzle, which is, sure, customers love Slack, but, if your support team is on Zendesk, bringing them into loop as and when required easily is a very, very important for the business, right? And also similar dynamics for the engineering team. I would say slightly weaker dynamics because engineers anyway are very comfortable with Slack.
Sure.
But they're also, the ability to take conversations and convert them into feature requests, to track them, and then sort of provide updates. I think that has been an interesting sort of observation. That was one. The second thing that I think I was also very surprised by is not everybody is a B2B SaaS company, and not everybody works directly with like sort of large customers on dedicated Slack channels. A lot of the parts of the world, Slack is not even that popular. If you go to sort of outside the US and go to like, sort of developing markets, the messaging is WhatsApp. It's not Slack.
Right.
Right. What is very interesting is that let's call these like B2 SMB companies.
Yeah.
Because typically these are not exactly B2C companies, but this would be like a large, let's say a tax consultancy, or maybe a digital marketing agency, or a health insurance provider. So anyway, so there's all these companies that work with customers in these tertiary systems, you might call, right? They're chatting with their customers on WhatsApp, or they're on phones, or like you said, SMS. There's a whole bunch of like stuff that's almost out of the corporate sort of umbrella. But when you have a customer problem, even at these companies, people bring them in. And where they bring them in is typically the company's internal chat system, right? So if it's Slack, people would just come and say, hey, I've got an irate customer over there. They were trying something and this is not working. Can you please help? Right. So they're acting as proxy for the customer. So what we found was that we were also able to help these companies. So even though they were not classic sort of B2B SaaS and the industry segment where my experience was mostly in, but these were like companies that were dealing with SMBs, but they were internally sort of having a setup where people were proxying the customers, so to say, and bringing issues. And they also needed a way to structure those conversations, because chat is unstructured, right? You can't track stuff. And so we were also able to help a lot of these companies. So that was very interesting for me, because I didn't have exposure to those kind of setups.
It's fascinating. I mean, two very distinct, different topics here, both equally fascinating, I think, from the perspective of workflow efficiency, and then also really trying to serve customers who may not, I mean, obviously in the software industry, we're very, very focused on B2B, and my observation is that B2B in general tends to have this kind of bias towards B2C, and somehow like a hesitancy to operate more like B2C does in a lot of ways. So like, for instance, if I were to engage with, I don't know, a retailer, for instance, and they have this, SMS chat, like, okay, I was texting, I needed to do a return at the Home Depot, which is, hardware store in the States. I went to the website and it kicked me into a chat conversation. It was like an iMessage conversation that it created for me. based on the fact that it knew I was an iPhone user, and we just had a text conversation with their bot, and then eventually that turned into an agent.
Right.
But those kinds of experiences, I think, are things that we're afraid of in B2B, when really, I mean, I think everybody has a cell phone in their hands. It's easy to understand what kind of cell phone or what kind of technology they have. And so to me, it's like a no-brainer that we would, have executive conversations, executive buyer updates on cell phone because they live in their cell phone, for instance, like as an example. But I loved what you brought up just in terms of like really going outside of B2B and really embracing some of the B2C things, and by association, like exposing ourselves to different ways of working than just what we're all used to.
Yeah, and honestly, it just sort of happened organically. We didn't go about looking for it.
Yeah,
I think these people had a pain point. They found us. We found them.
So cool.
A lot of yeah. So actually, I don't know whether we're going to talk about it. You brought up like these bots and sort of the AI stuff. I think that's also a very important part of the overall sort of like ecosystem now. That's also something we are investing in. We can touch base on that later.
Bots are. I mean, me personally, I would much rather engage a bot that was well trained and knew what it was doing than a human. That's just me. Like, sure, have a human as backup when I can't get what I need out of the bot. But I think there's some interesting things there that are fascinating to me, because I think the initial like reaction to bots is like, oh, bots are here to take my job, and bots are here to replace me and all that kind of stuff. And I think, sure, there's probably some of that. But my argument with bots is that, hey, they're actually here to make you more effective. Like, as a human stepping in, you're not bogged down by the minutia of all of the same password reset requests and blah, 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 like all this kind of stuff that we used to have to do in a very transactional environment. Now we're actually having, deeper conversations with customers that do need a little deeper layer of help, or, we are freeing up our teams to do human engagement after the bot is done.
Yeah. I would just add that, so we have a bot of our own, and we are ourselves using our own bot. So a bit of a dog pudding there.
Sure.
And so are many of our customers. It's not easy to displace a human. I think, of course, like you brought up some examples of like resetting passwords and things like that. So like, yes, there are areas which are very repetitive, and you can obviously, bring a very high degree of automation to those. But, if you go a little bit into product support, and which is a little bit non-standard, right? So you're not dealing with Windows or Apples and so on.
Yeah.
You're dealing with something a little bit sort of more niche than those, Our bot actually, first and foremost, we use it to help ourselves, right? So it has two modes. One of the modes is what we call an agent assistant mode. When we get a conversation or a request from a customer, it just pops up as an assistant and says, look, here's some things I can find for you.
Yeah.
Right? You asked, a few minutes back about, what we had learned. And I think AI has been also very fascinating. Unfortunately, we could probably spend the whole podcast talking about what we've learned in AI. But let me just take a quick digression here. One of the things I've learned is while the data is out there, documentation is out there, ChatGPT is out there, and so on. But it's not easy to go there.
Yeah.
You're sort of chatting with a customer, you're sort of talking, or you're in a context. For you to switch context, go somewhere, pull the data out, feed it in, create a prompt, it's a lot of work, right? So one of my core learnings with AI is that AI really needs to be embedded where you work. And that pattern is going to be, obviously in a few years, I think it's going to be everywhere. We've already seen that be very successful for developer tools, like with the Copilot stuff.
Yeah.
And there's the same feeling I have about, the software that we are building and the kind of job we do. It's not just about our software, is that AI needs to be embedded. If it's embedded in my workflow as a support agent or as a customer success person, where it has access to all the data.
Yeah.
It has, it understands the customer's history. It knows the configuration, right? So, in almost all B2B contexts, customers have different configurations. They're using the software for different purposes. They have it configured differently. They're on different pricing tiers. they're in different geographies. The software AI, understands what the customer context.
Mm-hmm.
It obviously understands like basic stuff like product documentation and like the essential knowledge bases and so on.
Yeah.
It understands the chat history, like so there's some context that has already happened. You kind of
Sure.
had some chats with the customer over the last month, 2 months, whatever, and as and when you're chatting, it just uses all of that to just help you,
Yeah.
right? And it's not displacing anybody. It's just like it is just such an amazing life savior,
Right.
it just makes you so much more effective.
Yeah.
I think it is a no-brainer. I think we're going to see it everywhere.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just that little thing you mentioned about like previous chat history and things like that. Like, okay, so last year I was dealing with um like this massive health insurance kind of thing where I had like, all these claims that I had to submit and I had to track them myself in like a spreadsheet, and there were it was this whole project. It turned into a whole project. And invariably with health insurance in the United States, you have to work through like, appeals process. It's like court almost. You have to go through the appeals process if they get rejected and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's this whole thing. And I remember thinking, at the time, like, as I did my weekly call to them, I was like, okay, I'm going to get a new agent. I'm going to carve out about 10 minutes to make sure that I could explain the context of the last year of work that I've been through. I'm going to share that, especially in highly complex environments like that, where there's a highly complex thing
Right.
that the customer has to navigate, and then the product or the service is highly complex and the history is complex. Like that's where the power of this stuff really comes in and makes those
Yeah.
agents, like I don't know how these, in those environments specifically where they're getting yelled at every other call, it's like, can you just make my life easier, please?
Yeah. Honestly, I hate to say this, but I don't know how much of the friction is intentional in
Well,
that
I was going to
industry.
say that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in U.S. health insurance, it is absolutely intentional.
So I don't know if technology can really save us when the incentives are so misaligned, But yes,
Absolutely.
and I think it should be able to help, but it's up to humans to use that help.
Yeah, absolutely. I need to come up with an AI tool that helps you negotiate a car. That's what I need. That's the other industry where, like, it's like, oh my god, I like the thought of going into a car dealership to purchase a vehicle gives me anxiety. Probably on purpose.
I'm both a CS person as well as I obviously I'm a product person. I sort of spend most of my time building the product. I also feel that a lot of complexity comes from non-natural language interfaces. Like, so all of us, we build products and we build this user interfaces, and every user interface is different.
Yeah.
Actually, that's one of the nice things about Slack. It's a very predictable user interface. But if you go outside of that,
Mm-hmm.
you think of any software you use, whether it's your HR software or your recruiting software or your financial software, and every one of them looks different, right? And it's always a learning curve to learn it.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I have to do this, and I have to go here, I have to press this, I have to do this, right? I think we're going to see a lot of natural language interfaces.
Yeah.
Help me do, like, I'll just tell you what to do, right? Why do you want me to learn, where you're, in which menu, this click, that click,
Sure.
4 clicks, and then I get to the thing that I want to do. I'll just give you an instruction, right? You figure it out.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there's also ways of reducing product complexity by offering natural language interfaces. I don't think we've seen as much of that yet, but I hope and think we will.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, it takes time to build these things, so I think even I'm struggling to roll some of this out, but I would love to.
Well, there's a middle ground that I think that I use on a almost daily basis, or maybe whatever. But like, for instance, in Google Slides or Google Sheets or whatever, if there's a specific functionality that I don't use on a daily basis, I don't go menu hunting anymore for that thing. I just go to the help thing and I type in what I want and it shows me what menu it's in. I was like, great. perfect, but it's like
Right.
that kind of thing where, in the future, if you want to, it's kind of already happening. Like if you want to create a document, instead of going and formatting and, building the table and doing
Right.
all that kind of stuff, you're just talking to the thing,
Right.
and
Right.
it does it.
Right.
So
I think not enough has happened. I think more needs to happen in this sort of direction.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're unfortunately running a little bit short on time because I think we could keep going on this conversation. But, I would love to, get a sense from you, a couple of things. The first one is, as a product person, yourself, and as you're building this company and continuing to grow and those kinds of things, like how do you expect your product teams to work with the post sale teams on things like product feedback and iteration and rollouts and those kinds of things? Like, in your experience, is that a natural thing for you, or is it kind of strained as it seems to be in a lot of places?
It gets strained very quickly. So, I've had, like I mentioned, I've been through a startup journey before this as well. And that company grew to about 400 odd people.
Mm,
It's a very mid-sized company.
yeah.
So I've definitely faced a lot of complexity, in exactly the situation you've described. So I think, first of all, let me just summarize quickly. Right? So I think one cannot have a one size fits all,
Yeah.
right? So at a smaller scale, when you are at a very small scale, I think the design, the patterns you would like to use to sort of solve these problems are very different. So, for example, at my scale, what I would really like to see is almost everybody in the company, but very importantly, product managers, to interact a lot with customers,
Mm,
right? That doesn't mean, of course, that they can't be part of every customer conversation,
sure.
obviously, right? But I think what I'm trying to highlight here is that there's a lot of value to sort of chatting with customers on a everyday basis in terms of understanding the use cases,
Yeah.
having very strong user empathy, and feeding that back into the development cycle,
Mhm.
right? Separate from that, there is this whole issue of trackability,
Yeah.
which I would say is, tracking feature requests and sort of bugs and so on, right? So I would sort of so try to separate these two dimensions. I think every product team should spend a part of their cycles in a customer facing role. Separately, they should also worry about the process.
Mhm.
They should, whether they are small or big, set up robust processes to capture user feedback. So we use, of course, aside from the engineering tools, we use a tool called Canny to log all the product features, and customers really like that. So I think one of the other things I've learned is that when customers feel like they're influencing your roadmap,
Yeah.
like they feel really happy, really, really happy.
They really
So
do.
we've seen that, giving customers access to these kind of roadmap sort of tracking tools and allowing them to sort of create entries or voting on them. Of course, you have to follow up, you have to deliver on the stuff.
Right.
But I think but at least you get you start on a good footing. They feel like they're part of the process.
Mhm.
One of the huge challenges I faced in my previous company when we grew big was actually trying to get things scheduled. I think that was a
Mm.
big challenge because there are never enough people for all the things that customers are asking you.
Yeah.
And of course, you want to make everybody happy, and there are different people invested in different customers. So some field people are invested in customer A, somebody is invested in customer B. There are obviously product managers who are on different sort of features, right? So there's a lot of stakeholders,
Yeah.
who all want to see their things get done,
Right.
and that is a very tough problem. My only 2 cents there, as a small company, I don't face as much of that yet, but at a large scale, the only thing I felt sort of really helped us was to sort of divide and conquer.
Mm.
Was to say that, look, if you have 100 units of bandwidth available in terms of building something, let's give you some quotas. So I would go and give the support team a little bit of my bandwidth. I will say, look, you get 10 units,
Yeah.
and you can find like the 5 problems that are really causing a lot of grief to you in customer support,
Mhm.
and we'll try to turn them around
Yeah.
in this, like, let's say, the coming release, right? Similarly, I'd go to the solutions architects or the pre-sales people. I'll go to the customer success people. And of course, then there are strategic holders, right? There would be the product team itself and the executive team.
Sure.
So I think I found that that kind of a approach towards managing the available bandwidth in a very transparent manner, where everybody knew that they had some things they could ask for, but not everything, because there just wasn't enough bandwidth to go around.
Yeah.
It took us a while to sort of formalize that and to perfect that, but it was really good. People liked being heard, just like customers. Internal stakeholders also like being heard.
Sure.
And then if you could deliver something to everybody, at least they felt like, yes, we were all getting taken care of.
I think that's super valuable. I mean, as you can imagine, the majority of listeners are, very much in the CX space. And I think a lot of them tend to struggle sometimes with how to really effectively engage with, an R&D organization. And so I think those little insights are very valuable, just in terms of giving somebody in let's say a CS leadership position, the talk track and the talking points, so they can speak the same language, so to speak, which is cool.
Yeah.
Look, it's been an absolute pleasure. And as we kind of round down, I would love to know if there's anything kind of in your content diet that you or things you pay attention to, podcasts, books, anything like that you think would be great for the audience. And then also if you have any shout outs that you want to give.
Yeah, my diet is probably a junk diet, but I spend not the ideal diet. So unfortunately, I'm pretty spread out. I as an engineer, I have to keep up a little bit with all this AI stuff, and I'm building a lot of stuff. I honestly, like, Twitter has become sort of my newsfeed. So that's where I spend a lot of my time. I get sort of my daily diet of whether it's AI or like CS or like, VCs spouting wisdom, or like other founders sort of talking about stuff. I get a lot of my diet from there. There's obviously, great handles to follow there, but I think there are some amazing sort of people talking about how to run companies. So I think, for example, there's sorry, I'm not going to get the name correct, but
it's
a gentleman by the name, last name Girdley, I think Girdley. He's pretty famous. He has obviously a huge number of followers, so I'm sure you can find him. He talks about building like small businesses, mid-sized businesses, and how he's built like dozens of them. And he talks about accounting. You talked about accounting, so he talked about accounting. He talks about just maintaining cash flows and all kinds of stuff, right? And I really find that useful, because it takes a lot of time to like read books. But if you read through somebody who spent like 20, 30 years of their life sort of building like a dozen businesses, and they can distill their wisdom down into like a few hundred words, or maybe a few thousand even. I find that like really, really useful. So I really like following those kind of folks on Twitter. I'm actually not a huge Reddit person, but I'm sometimes taken aback by how much you can learn on Reddit.
So true.
I find that when I want to do product research, I often just go to Reddit and just sort of do some searches, and I just read what people are chatting about, and I learn so much. I learn about other companies. I learn about my competitors. I learn about just people like just talking about the problems they have. So I'm a huge fan, I think, of those forums as well. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, all of my diet, content diet, is very, very sort of biased towards the social sort of what you might call a little bit of the junk diet, perhaps.
Reddit is a good one though, because literally, like anything that you would ever be interested in, there's something on Reddit about it, like anything.
I'm not very big on, like I said, I'm actually not on the Reddits myself, sort of responding in real time and stuff, but I often use it for like more like research kind of stuff, and I find it very useful in that mode.
There's an amazing podcast called Endless Thread. I don't know if you know it, but basically they pick a Reddit thread to just go deep on, and then they go do research on it and really talk through it and all that kind of stuff. It's really fascinating. So it's just, and it's
Right.
it's kind of like, I love random things, and it's the epitome of that, like just random things on Reddit. It's great.
Yeah, sorry, and I think you had a second part. I don't know if I answered your
Yeah,
question
any
fully.
shout outs that you want to give, or anybody that you want to?
In terms of products, like I said, we've in terms of software, there's a ton of stuff we use ourselves, but yeah, we like Canny a lot. It's a great tool for maintaining product feedback. Honestly, some of the tools are like well known, so I don't know if
Sure.
it makes sense. But like simple things like Hotjar, watching user recordings, those things help us a lot. And we have a very traditional stack. Like we obviously we're big users of HubSpot. It's really helped us sort of consolidate all of our customer information into one place. And so on.
Well, that'll be interesting if they do get swallowed up by Google at some point.
Yeah, actually, the other, one of the things that is sort of maybe a slightly newer that I would give a shout out to is, Clearbit, right? I mean, I think they got bought out by HubSpot.
Mm-hmm.
So that whole class of software, where you get some visibility into who's coming to your website.
Yep.
There's a little bit of gray area there, in terms of intrusion of privacy and things like that. But I mean, in general, sure. Obviously, it doesn't track people at the individual level. It just sort of like tells you which company is visiting your website. That's really been very useful for me. It's just, the problem, with running a business that's sort of, like open for business on the web and sort of getting visitors and then getting a few leads is like, the people who sign up, you see them. But, for every sign up, there's 100 people who don't sign up and you don't get to see them, right? So. Yeah. Just having that little bit of visibility that, look, these are the kinds of people that are coming to my site, checking me out at a very coarse level. It's just honestly, like, it's really hard to now think of a life without that from a sales and marketing perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the demographic information alone is crazy valuable. So yeah.
Yeah, just basic stuff. The company X is checking you out. That's really awesome. Yeah.
Look, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I love what you and the team are building, and can't wait to keep track of you guys and see where everything goes. But
sure,
huge fan. So thanks a ton for the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wonderful being on the show, and it was a great chat. Actually, I didn't feel like I was it felt very informal exchange of thoughts. I really love the format.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Digital CX Podcast. If you like what we're doing, consider leaving us a review on your podcast platform of choice. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment down below. It really helps us to grow and provide value to a broader audience. You can view the Digital Customer Success Definition Word Map and get more information about the show and some of the other things that we're doing at digitalcustomersuccess.com. This episode was edited by Lifetime Value Media, a media production company founded by our good mutual friend Dylan Young. Lifetime Value aims to serve the content, video, audio production needs of the CS and post-sale community. They're offering services at a steep discount for a limited time, so navigate to lifetimevaluemedia.com, go have a chat with Dylan, and make sure you mention the Digital CX Podcast sent you. I'm Alex Turkovich. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.